All right. Let me start off by asking you a question this morning as we dive into the message, Pedro. How certain are you about the trajectory of your life? On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that you are wise enough that you're able to see ahead and see those unexpected cracks in the road or in the path ahead, and that you would not tumble over a cliff down an unseen abyss? How confident are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And for many of us, we might say, well, I'm pretty confident because my wisdom and my life are in Jesus' hands. Theoretically, you rely and trust in Jesus, but practically, a lot of times we rely and trust on our educational opportunities, our financial security, our abilities and capabilities. And you may even start off your journey trusting Jesus and his wisdom for your life. But when the road ahead of you gets a little bit bumpy or a little bit foggy or a little bit treacherous, you don't get that school that you hoped for or that job that you hoped for. You don't get the girl or the guy of your dreams. You invested all of your financial stakes in the stock market before it crashed or the housing market before it crashed. Or you get diagnosed with depression or cancer. Or a hurricane or fire destroys everything that you have built up in this life. You see, the trajectory of your life can change in an instant. But I want to pose the question to you. What if the quality of your life does not have to change with the circumstances? What if you could not only start off your journey well in life with Jesus, but you could continue well, regardless of the ups and downs, and even end well, regardless of the conditions of your life? And I believe that that's what having Jesus and having his wisdom does for us in our lives. So if you have a Bible, turn in it to Proverbs chapter 4. Proverbs chapter 4. We're in this series called Wiser, where we are journeying through the book of Proverbs to discover biblical wisdom, which we have defined from the Hebrew word as the practical skill in the art of godly living. And because wisdom describes character, right? It describes like how can you live in such a way that you have good character, then what it's really describing is Jesus. Because everything that points to goodness and character points to Jesus. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 24, we remember that Paul talks about how Jesus is both the power of God to change as well as the wisdom of God to live in our lives. And so, wisdom is about living a Christ-centered life, and then as we do, that he shapes us and empowers us to become more and more like him so that you and I can actually grow in wisdom. Now, I want to, as we've been doing, because Proverbs is all Hebrew poetry, I've been trying to give you a little bit of a reading guide every time to each different section that we read through. And this morning, what I want you to hear is that, first of all, what we're reading in chapter 4 is actually 3 different speeches, okay? So a lot of times, the previous messages I've given, those have been entire speeches. But one of the ways you can tell from these beginning chapters of 1 through 9 is that each new speech begins with, "Oh, my son," or "My son, hear my son," this, that, and the other. So we're going to see 3 different speeches today. And you might think that they are unrelated at first, but I want you to pay attention. Here's your cheat code. Pay attention to repeated key words throughout the text, all right? Because what that is that when you see these repeated words or thoughts, they're emphasizing a theme within each of these speeches. So each speech has a different theme, but there's some repeated keywords that tie all 3 of the speeches together. And so let me give you some cheat codes first, okay? So I'm just going to give you the first 3, the big 3 for this passage, for each of the 3 speeches. And that's, number 1, is that one of the ongoing themes is a focus on the internal direction of the heart. So we see that in verse 4, 21, and 23. And when the author talks about the heart, when they're talking about the heart in Hebrew culture, you're not just talking about emotions, but you're talking about your soul, the core of your being, your identity and your values, your attitudes and character. Okay? And so when you'll see in this proverb that as it focuses on the direction, the internal direction of your heart, that means it's focusing on what's inside your heart and where my inside is taking me, the direction of my heart, the path that it's taking, all right? Cheat code number 1. Number 2 is there's a repeated theme. You're going to see some words like guard, watch, keep. And I want to tell you that those are all the same words. There's 2 words that kind of mean those 3 things, either guarding, keeping, or watching, but they're actually all the same word. And in fact, the exact same word appears in the key verse in the middle of each of the different speeches in verses 6, 13, and 23. So that's kind of our cheat code for this morning. And then lastly, the last one is that you'll see the word live or life repeated throughout each of the three speeches. And so keeping those three things in mind, let's put together what the main idea of the text is, and then we'll figure it out to see it for yourself as we read. And the big idea, if you don't remember anything else, as we read Proverbs 4, is that guarding your heart, there's that guarding, your heart, there's that second word, with wisdom from God determines the trajectory of life's journey. All right? And so guarding your heart with wisdom from God determines the trajectory of life's journey. And so the passage is broken down into three interconnected speeches, like I said. So in verses 1 through 9, the start of the journey of wisdom in your heart and life. Verses 10 through 19, in that next slide, is how we continue the journey. And in verses 20 through 27, how we complete the journey to end in wisdom. So that's how these three speeches are interconnected. And so let's start reading in chapter 4, verse 1. Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight. For I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teaching. When I was a son with my own father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words. Keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom. And whatever you get insight. Prize her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. So let's stop right there. That's the end of the first speech. What's happening here? Verses 1 through 4. Remember, this is a dad instructing his son, and this dad starts off by telling a story about his dad and the godly heritage of wisdom that has gone before him. And in verse 4, he says to his son, when I was a young man just like you, my dad, your grandpa, gave me wisdom that I want to pass on to you. Let your heart hold fast to these words so that you might live. In other words, that you'll be able to live well by internalizing into your heart this godly wisdom in the depth of your beings and beliefs, your choices and character. Verse 5, here we go. Here's the core advice from Grandpa. Get wisdom, all right? And then he repeats that in verse 7, beginning of verse 7. The beginning of wisdom is to get wisdom. You see that? All right. And then he goes on to say in that verse, if you spend your dollars and your days on getting anything, get wisdom. That's what he wants you to get. Get wisdom and insight. Now, for those of you who have been tracking with us since the beginning of Proverbs chapter 1, here's the Easter egg. I know you're thinking like, well, I thought the beginning of wisdom was fear of the Lord. And here it says the beginning of wisdom is get wisdom. Well, which is it? The answer is yes. It's both. Because remember that I taught you that Proverbs is cumulative. So the author of Proverbs will say one thing and then kind of adds on another lump of clay, like a potter shaping clay, will add on more bits and pieces to it to flesh it all out. And so as we kind of accumulate these thoughts, he's saying that yes, it's fear of the Lord. Yes, it's also getting wisdom. And so the picture here is that if you want a starting place, get wisdom from God, then live it out. You remember we talked about what fear of the Lord means, to live it out in intentional and reverential awareness and awe of his presence and his power. That's your starting point. And so God gives wisdom, but we have to go get it. That requires that we actively ask him for wisdom, that we actively pay attention and listen to Jesus and look for how he might be speaking. It requires that we actively pursue his will and his will from his word and from prayer and from wise and godly counsel. Now, many people want a better life. Many people ask for wisdom, but very few actively seek Jesus and his vehicles to get it in their lives. Well, how do I know if I'm getting wisdom? Like, let's say I've been seeking out for it and I hear something. How do I know if I'm getting it? What does life look like? That trajectory of life look like? Verse 6. If you're getting real godly wisdom from the Lord, then wisdom guards you. It protects and prevents you from plunging headfirst into self-destruction. So wisdom guards you, and then verse 8 and 9, wisdom honors you. Remember, we talked about this in chapter 1, verse 9. It's like a wreath that gets awarded to great heroes in of the nation, that you're crowned with godly living and decision-making so that people can see the beauty and value of Christ. But the point of this passage, as Pedro has already put up on the screen, is that we start the journey of the heart in our lives by deciding to actively get God's wisdom. You have to just make that decision. Do you want wisdom to guard your life and honor your life? Well, here's the starting point. You have to decide that you need it, that you want it, that you'll actively seek it, that you'll actively look for it till you get it. And the question is, do you? And I think most people are kind of like, sure, of course I do. And yet too often our priorities and choices tell a different story. Many of you know that I meet with people as a pastor just for counseling. I don't know why I'm not necessarily any wiser than anyone else, but a lot of people come to me because I am the pastor. And when they do, I actually have developed over the years that I have specific goals that I have when I meet with people for counseling. And my number one goal is to equip you with tools or a plan so that you can get wisdom for yourself, to be honest. And so once people are given a few tools or a plan, if they want to continue meeting with me because the crisis or the problem is ongoing, they're still looking for wisdom, next time I meet with them, I'll always ask, okay, so what steps have you taken? In other words, like, how have you been trying to get wisdom? How has Jesus been speaking to you when you examine his word as you've been praying to him? What research have you done about this subject or this problem? What resources have you applied? Like there's, all these kinds of resources available in our community or at the library or this, that, and the other. What does other wise and godly counsel say about this issue? Because I don't want you to just rely on me. I'm not Messiah. I don't know everything. Or if your issue is emotional or relational or mental health struggle, have you gone to see a Christian counselor? And too often I get the response, none of the above. I've done nothing different. I've done nothing to change. I've done nothing to get wisdom. And I'll ask, well, why? What happened since the last session? Well, I'm too busy, I'm too tired, I'm too overwhelmed. But you're stuck in misery. And you're not doing whatever you can to get some wisdom. You just keep applying the same mistakes and solutions that got you stuck in the first place. And many of you know that I'm a recovering addict, and in the 12-step program, we have a word for that. We call it insanity. When you keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result. That's what the definition of insanity is. And so when you're not seeking wisdom and you're not getting wisdom and you keep trying the same solution, all you have then is just pie in the sky wish fulfillment that things will turn out differently, instead of actually seeking and responding to Jesus, the greatest source of wisdom and change in heaven and earth. And so if you're going to get wisdom, then you need to make it a priority. And so the question is, do we really want God and his wisdom? That's that next slide. Do you actively and intentionally look for it? Let me put it to you this way. Judas Iscariot, he walked with the very incarnation of God's wisdom himself, Jesus. Yet he fell into sin and self-destruction. He was set in his preconceived patterns. He wasn't looking for any new wisdom from Jesus. So I want to tell you, simply hanging around wise people is not enough to benefit from them. If you want to get wisdom, where are you going to get it? So it's cool, like in verses 1 through 4, it's not just kind of throwaway introduction. Like this dad and like his dad, the grandpa, you can seek a wise friend or a wise mentor, somebody who's gone before you, somebody who's walked faithfully with the Lord. Learn from their wisdom. Think carefully about what they're saying. Look at how it compares to God's word and ask many questions of them. And if you do, Jesus will enable you to benefit greatly from the wisdom of others, just as Solomon is from his dad and his granddad. And then lastly, I want to ask you, when you see wisdom, when somebody gives you wisdom, you find it in his word, Jesus puts a conviction in your heart, he puts wise counsel that says the same thing. Verse 8 asks, do you embrace her? That means, do you hold tight to wisdom? Do you put a ring on it by intentionally procuring wisdom and practicing wisdom? Or you're not really committed to it. So it's just, instead of applying it, it's just a suggestion. Like, oh, that's really wise that you forget by the end of your day. What was that thing that Chosen told me that was so smart, would have changed my life? Too bad, so sad. Now that's just the starting point of wisdom. The question is where do we go from here? So look at verse 10. Hear, my son, and accept my words, that the years of your life may be many. I have taught you the way of wisdom. I have led you in the paths of uprightness. When you walk, your step will not be hampered. And if you run, you will not stumble. Keep hold of instruction. Do not let go. Guard her. There's that word again. For she is your life. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of the evil. Avoid it. Do not go on it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they, the wicked, the evil, cannot sleep unless they've done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. Eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness, and they do not know over what they stumble. So what's the pattern here? Remember, I told you you're supposed to be looking for key words, so I'm hoping you're hanging in there with me. Verse 11 and 18, the path of the righteous. Verse 14 and 19, the path of the wicked, the way of the wicked, the walk of the wicked. Verse 12, walk, step, run. Verse 12 and 16, stumble. Verse 15, don't go, turn from, pass by. What's the theme there? It's all about where you walk and how you walk. And so the picture that the author is painting for us is that life is a journey, and there's no quick fix. You just walk it one step at a time. And specifically, that on this journey of life, that there are two paths. The path of wisdom versus the path of wickedness. And that these two are mutually exclusive tracks. You cannot be wise and be wicked at the same time. You cannot be walk in the way of wickedness and be wise at the same time. And so the idea from this part of the passage is that in order to continue your journey of life, you need to be able to distinguish between these two different paths. And so let's look at how are these two paths different. How do you know if you're walking on the way of wisdom versus the way of wickedness? Verse 10, wisdom enhances the quality and the quantity of your life. How does it do that? In verse 11, by making your path upright. It says paths of uprightness. That means that as we rely on and respond to Jesus and his instruction, it kind of sets us on a trajectory, forms our character. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Forms your character to produce a trajectory of godliness and character in your life so you won't make evil decisions and self-destructive decisions. Verse 12 kind of confirms that. That guides you to walk without stumbling over the obstacles of sinfulness and its consequences. So that, verse 13, if you put all those pieces together, because of all those reasons, we should guard wisdom in our lives because it gives us life, right? And so, if life is a journey, then walking the way of wisdom requires that we take one step at a time, one moment at a time, one character formation at a time with Jesus. But it's a slow process and requires patience. Now let's look at the contrast so that we can distinguish these two paths. Let's look at what the shadow of the way of wisdom looks like. Verse 14, Solomon tells us, or his granddad tells us, don't take the wicked's path. Verse 15, instead of what we talked about before, guarding and keeping this way, this is the way that you should avoid. You need to avoid it and take the first off-ramp. Verse 16, the way of wickedness is that someone who can't sleep till they've done wrong. In other words, it's like someone who's like a drug addict who is restless until they can gratify and indulge their sinfulness. So instead of patiently allowing wisdom to shape your character, wickedness is shaped by its impulses. And the reality is that only one of those things can be in charge of your decision making. In other words, if you don't have character, then you're going to be driven by your impulse to self-gratification. But one of those two things is going to be in charge of your decision making process. Second half of verse 16 is that instead of preventing stumbling, you cause others to stumble along with you. Verse 17, instead of bringing life, you feed off of bringing violence and harm. That's that person who says, you know what, just like the wise person, I too want a quality and quantity of life. It's just that I want it apart from God or having to obey him, and it's just that I don't care about, if I'm going to get that quality and quantity of life, I don't care about the cost to other people. So I'll use and abuse other people to get the life that I want. And I think about in the news, many of you have been hearing and reading about Harvey Weinstein. If you don't know who he is a movie producer, big name, a lot of finances in Hollywood, produced movies like Shakespeare in Love, Gangs of New York, Pulp Fiction. He's the producer of Project Runway, one of the most biggest hit TV shows, and he's won 19 awards, including an Oscar throughout his career. He was the producer who gave their first break to many of the actors who would become some of the greatest actors of our generation. But he has a bad reputation, and women tend to avoid him. And stories are finally coming to light of this man and his behavior, how he would oftentimes invite young women actors for private meetings. Oftentimes, or if they were kind of afraid of that, he would have his assistant there, and when the person would come to meet with them, a woman would come to meet with him, he would dismiss his assistant. And as soon as he does so, then he would start to come on to them and coerce them, oftentimes meeting with them, saying, let's have a meeting, but let's meet up in my private hotel room, and sexually harass or sexually assault them. And as he tried to make a public apology, but he also gave an excuse. What was his excuse? He said, well, I'm sorry, it's just I'm kind of like a product of my times, like a product of the 60s and the 70s where sexuality was very open and different. It's just, boys being boys, right? But what we're learning is that no, it's not just boys will be boys. We're finally learning as a society that boys will be held accountable for this kind of stuff. And so we're looking at a man whose life and his decision-making was driven by impulses to be of instant gratification. He coerces other people to stumble into his sinfulness and selfishness, and he causes grievous harm to the hearts and souls and bodies of many people. That's what the path of wickedness looks like. Now, for us, that's repulsive to hear about a man like this. Thank God that's not me. May I suggest to you that we travel, I'm not trying to compare apples and oranges, but that we might travel in the same direction at least, more often than you think. What I mean is, there are times when you and we're out of control maybe in our words or in our anger, or we have addictions to food or drugs or pornography or stuff or your games or your phone. We're a slave to our impulses, similar to Harvey Weinstein. Or when we sin, we minimize it to convince others to compromise along with us. So we tell people like, well, you question like, is that okay, Josh? Well, it's okay to bend the rules a little bit or bend the truth a little bit or fudge the numbers a little bit or get a little bit drunk or get a little bit sexual even though we're not married. And we cause others to stumble along with us. Or when there's a pattern in our lives that people get hurt so that I can get ahead and get what I want. And we rationalize, they were annoying, they deserved it. We inflict violence and harm on other people's souls. And Jesus would say, maybe you're not a Harvey Weinstein, but you're not walking in the way of wisdom. You're walking in the path of wickedness. And so the conclusion of the second speech in verse 18 through 19, he says, you can distinguish these paths because the path of wisdom's character and righteousness shines increasingly brighter, like the break of dawn all the way until the noonday sun. It's clean and clear. There's not a cloud of confusion in the sky. But compare that against the way of the wicked, which is obscured. It's lost. It's groping around in the dark till it not just causes other people to stumble, but their own lives stumble down into the abyss. And so to continue on the right trajectory for life, I want to ask you, are you distinguishing which path you're actually on? And it may be like most of your life, many areas of your life are going in that direction, but maybe there's this one area that kind of has decided to take a detour and gotten on the wrong on-ramp. You may be wise in many areas of life, but let me ask you, what is that one area where you lack clarity right now? May I suggest you can use this matrix in Proverbs 4 to discern if you've taken the wrong turn. And those 4 categories are what drives your decisions. Is it character that's driving your decisions, helping you make decisions, or impulse to gratify sinfulness? What's the effect of the path you're on yourself? Does it give you life or does it harm you? On others, does it harm them or does it make them stumble? And then lastly, how do you need to respond once you figure it out? Do you need to guard it, the path you're on, or do you need to avoid it? All right? All right. We've figured out how to start on this path of wisdom. We've figured out how to continue on the path of wisdom. But how do we ensure that we'll end this journey well? Okay, let me give you a cheat code, another cheat code. I want you to pay attention as we read this verse, this last speech. Pay attention to the subjects as well as the verbs, okay? All right, last speech, here we go. Verse 20. My son, be attentive to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Let them not escape from your sight. Keep them within your heart. for they are life to those who find them and healing to all their body or all their flesh, depending on your translation. Verse 23, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. Put away from you crooked speech, and put devious talk far from you. Let your eyes look directly forward, your gaze be straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. All right, people who are still awake with me, you're paying very close attention. Verse 20, this dad says, pay careful attention to godly and biblical wisdom. How do we do that? Verse 20, incline your ear. Verse 21, keep your eyes and your heart on wisdom. Verse 22, find it for your life and for your body. Verse 23, guard it in your heart. What's the theme? What's the theme here? What's going on here? You catch it? He's telling us to orient all of our senses, all of our receptors, everything that brings stuff into us in one direction to do what? To receive wisdom. So he's telling us, pay careful attention where and what and how you direct your senses and your attention, because all the things you're receiving, everything that you're allowing in has a cumulative effect. It influences us, it shapes us. And so we ask the question, is what I'm looking at wise or wicked? Is who I listen to wise or wicked? Is what I'm storing in my heart wise or wicked? Is what I'm putting into my body healing or harmful? Verse 22. Okay, got that part? Now let's look at the second half of this speech. Verse 24, guard what's about to come out of your mouth. Verse 25, direct your eyes and your gaze. And verse 26 and 27, direct your feet straight on wisdom's path. So the first half of this last speech is guard the input to receive God's wisdom. And the second half is guard your output in the direction of wisdom. Make sure that so what's coming in is coming from wisdom, and what's going out is going in the same direction as wisdom. Pretty cool, right? Now let's look at I know some of you like this literary stuff. I love it, but it helps us understand the meaning. Now, here's the key that I want to land on. Of all the body parts mentioned, did you notice which was the only one that was mentioned twice? Verse 21, and then at the very center of the passage, dividing how you receive wisdom with the receptors of wisdom, and versus the output, is it says, in the center, the key of this passage, 23, above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. That's not what it says in the ESV. Let me give you the literal translation, because I think actually the ESV loses a little bit the meaning that's actually better in the NIV. But the literal translation is, above every guarding, guard your heart. In other words, above all the things you guard, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, above all those things, number one priority is guard your heart. It's the central water pumping station where Jesus' wisdom flows in and life flows out. Now, what I want to ask you is, what does that mean to guard it? Here's the cool thing. Let me give you, this is why it's one of the key words in this whole passage. I love this stuff. So there's two similar words that are used throughout this entire chapter, in all three speeches, for those words that I told you were similar: keep, guard, and watch. Two words that were used for that. But there's a subtle difference. Even though they mean the same things, keep, guard, and watch. One word in the Hebrew is called shamar. You don't need to know it. But it occurs only a few times throughout the text, and it doesn't occur in all three speeches. But it's built on the primitive root to build a hedge around something. Keep, guard, and protect. And so I want you to picture in your mind, plant a shrub, a bush, you water it, and it grows up, and then you basically leave it alone, right? I mean, you trim it from time to time, but basically you leave it alone, and it forms a hedge of protection, a protective barrier around it, you. That's passive guarding, right? You don't have to do much. You just kind of build it up and you leave it alone. Passive guarding. In the key verses, with each of the three in the middle of every single one of these speeches, verse 6, verse 13, verse 23, it's a different word. Natsar, which means to diligently and vigilantly patrol the perimeter like a watchman in the night. Active guarding. You see the difference? So instead of just passively guarding, so some of us, we set up passive guards in our life like, okay, well, I'm not going to allow, a lot of sexual imagery to come in, so I turn on my internet, filters, this, that, and the other, and I'm done. Passive guarding, right? But active guarding means that if we want to finish the race well, we complete this journey by actively guarding our hearts with wisdom from God. That means that I am specifically by actively and intentionally and regularly guarding what comes in to receive God's wisdom, guarding what comes out that reflects God's wisdom in my life, because our input shapes our output of our values and our emotions and our attitudes and our character and our actions and reactions to things that happen in this life. Your input shapes your output. So I could spend a lot of time kind of lecturing you about, well, here's a lot of things that you should not let into your life or into your heart, right? And that's probably what you're expecting, that pastoral guilt. And there's some truth to that, right? Because there's things that we shouldn't let into our ears, our eyes, our hearts, like false narratives from movies or from people about what dating and marriage should look like, or what success looks like, or what happiness looks like. That's often false narratives. But instead, what I think I want to share with you is what I think we need in order to make room in our hearts for truth and wisdom. That there's a God in heaven who is holy enough and loving enough that he sent his only Son to die and rise to give you an eternal life and a restored relationship with him. And these are actually interconnected thoughts, eternal life and restored relationship, and we'll connect it to wisdom in just a sec. It means that you're not just eternally living someday. You just kind of live and, I don't know, it's okay, eternal existence, I guess. But having eternal life in a restored relationship means that we can enjoy a quality of life from our relationship with him, springing from our relationship with him today. That means intimacy, peace, joy, wisdom can all be ours. And so I have three practical suggestions that might help us experience that and maybe help you to guard your heart, right? So 3 suggestions for you. Number 1 is you might consider turning down the noise in your life. Turn down the noise. What I mean is a lot of times we leave a lot of things on in the background. Like some of you like to leave your TV on or your music on the background, or the background noise of your life is not actually physical noise, but you're checking your phone constantly for news or for your email or for social media. There's so much background noise in our minds and our hearts so that we cannot hear Jesus and his wisdom. We need to guard the input so that there can be better output. Let me put it to you this way. When I first, on the very first date I went with my wife, Melissa, long before we were married, our first date, I want to tell you what I did. Like, I prepared this great soundtrack that I had kind of burned to a CD. If you don't know what that is, that's okay, you're young. But I prepared this great soundtrack of background music that would be playing throughout our entire first date, okay? And so, some of it was like, kind of fun, cool music, make me sound like I have like this really cool personality, and some of it was really upbeat and funny stuff, and some stuff that's a little bit more, romantic and sweet, and to show I'm sensitive and this, that, and the other. So I was pretty hyped up about this. And so, pulled up in my car, up to her house, rang the doorbell, escorted to my car, opened the door like a gentleman, had her sit down, closed the door, turned on my car, soundtrack is playing. 10 seconds into the drive, you know what she does? She reaches over, she's talking to me, and then turns off my radio. What are you doing? Do you know how much time I spent on this soundtrack? I did not say that because it was the first date, okay? But she turned off my radio. First of all, who turns off someone else's radio when you come into the car? But she turned off my radio, and then she turned off my music every subsequent date that we went on. And I'm one of those guys that used to be like, I need that background music. That's like the soundtrack of my life, all right? But I got used to it, like having my radio off in the car. So now, actually, when I'm alone in the car, even when there's nobody around, I've gotten to the habit, I leave my radio off. I purposely turn it off. And I found that oftentimes I think best and I hear Jesus best. Actually, in the car while I drive, when it's quiet. Because that's some of the only times I have a sustained long period to quiet down. And so I usually drive in the quiet. And I want to ask you, would you consider turning down the noise? Because if your ear is attuned to heaven, so that when God whispers, maybe you'll be ready to respond. First suggestion, turn down the noise. Second one, I want you to consider slimming down. Not your diet. I know some of you are like me, need to lose a couple pounds, but slim down your schedule is what I'm talking about. It is really hard to connect with Jesus when you're constantly rushed and constantly thinking about what's next. I need to prepare for that next thing. when your calendar is so packed that you have no time and no room to read God's word, to talk with Jesus. And so I want to recommend to you, your problem when you say, I'm too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed, is because you haven't made it a priority to say, remember I talked about this a few weeks ago? Maybe cut some things out of your calendar. Because when you do, you're creating space and a pace for what's important instead of what's urgent. There's a lot of things that are urgent in this life that are not that important, especially if you need wisdom. And lastly, I want to challenge you to sit down. Sit down specifically to enjoy Jesus today. It's really hard to, like for a husband and a wife or good friends, to sit down and if our only goal is when we talk is I need to exchange information for you to give me things, then you're probably not going to get a whole lot of blessing of wisdom and enjoyment of that person. Yet we treat Jesus the same way. God, I got about 2 minutes, so please give me this for my day, and thank you for that, and if you could also fix this in my life. All right, good talk. Let's talk tomorrow, okay? May I encourage you that you quiet down, you slim down your schedule, and you sit down so that you can enjoy Jesus, because when you do, you find that with a good friend like him, the best friend that you could have, that's when you can hear his wisdom. All right, let me end with this. In the spring of 1942, there was a young 19-year-old Air Force mechanic, just a mechanic, works on planes, doesn't go up in them, but he had to go up in an AT-11 twin-engine bombardier as part of the crew, like one of the guys, he's the mechanic there just to simply fix stuff. And it was his very first time ever on an airplane. And he totally threw up all over the place. And when they landed the plane, he said to himself, I have made a terrible mistake as far as career choices in life. And he was seriously considering quitting and trying to see if he could get out of his Army contract, Air Force contract. Now, things took a turn for the worse when that summer they actually called him up for pilot training because we were starting to enter preparations for World War II. But it turned out that he actually had an affinity for it, and so he became actually an ace pilot during World War II and was notable for shooting down over 11 German planes. After the war, he loved flying so much that he actually became a test pilot. So on October 14th, 1947, with 2 broken ribs that he had gotten from a horseback accident, so that he was unable to shut the cockpit of his plane by himself, he flew an experimental plane, this bullet-shaped plane called the X-1, and became the very first person to break the sound barrier. Amazing life. That man is Chuck Yeager, one of the most decorated brigadier generals of all time. And many of you know that second story about being the first man to break the sound barrier, but very few of you know about the first one. Because you see, it's not just about if you start well. It's more important that you end well. That's what people remember about you. And many of you are stuck in a complex issue or situation in this life, and you have no idea where to begin. You need to learn how to start well in the wisdom of Jesus. Others of you, you've started the race well, but you've lost sight of wisdom. You don't know how to continue in it, or you don't know how to reach the finish line. Would you consider where you might need wisdom and seek Jesus, who 1 Corinthians 1 tells us is the power of God and the wisdom of God? So let me give you 3 last prayer questions that you can meditate on. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up as we start to wrap up. But let me give you a prayer guide for you this morning. 3 things I want you to pray through. What new journey do I need to start off by getting wisdom? That you know that God actively gives and we actively need to get it. You can ask in prayer. You can search the Word of God. You can read a godly book. You can consult a godly mentor or advisor. You can seek Christian counseling. But I want to challenge you this morning to start asking, even right now, take a moment and ask Jesus, what is the new journey that I need to start off by getting wisdom? And then ask for the courage to prioritize it, procure it, and practice it. Secondly, in what area or issue of life is it hard to continue in wisdom? You lack clarity. You've gotten lost. You're confused along the way. Perhaps you could ask Jesus to help you determine if you're on the right path. You can use that evaluation matrix we talked about in verses 10 through 19. What's driving your decisions? What's the effect on yourself and others? How do you respond once you've figured out which path you're on? And lastly, what issue or area of life do you struggle to complete well? In what specific ways is Jesus calling you to guard your heart because you haven't been, so that you can receive and reflect his wisdom and his life? May you grow wiser in life's journey today. May you start well by actively getting the wisdom you need from Jesus. May you continue well by actively discerning the path that you're on today. And may you complete the journey well by actively guarding your heart. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we surrender ourselves at this time, and as we sing these last two songs of worship, we humbly ask that you would do surgery with us, that you would meet with us. Help us to come before you with journeys, areas of our lives that we need you to help us start in wisdom, continue in wisdom, and reach completion in wisdom. May your people encounter the living God even